Beneath the surface of the Atacama Desert, something is about to break. Not a machine, not a cable, something far older. A pillar, just one, holding up a weight the world never imagined it was carrying. And tonight it will fail. Copper isn't just a metal, it's the circulatory system of civilization. Every wire in your wall, every server in the cloud, every electric car on the road. All of it flows from places like this. And this mine, Chuquicamata, is the biggest of them all. Deep in the lower levels, a structural anomaly has been growing for 3 years. Engineers flagged it, reports were filed, budgets were cut. Tonight, nature sends the final notice. And no one is ready for what follows. One mine, one pillar, one crack. The world runs on copper in ways most people never consider. Undersea cables, power grids, military communications, the internet itself, a vast physical network of copper and glass. At 11:47 p.m. local time, it happens. The pillar gives way completely, unable to hold the mountain. The mountain above it follows. And the world above, sleeping, unaware, is about to change forever. Within minutes, every seismograph in South America registers the collapse. Emergency protocols are triggered. The mountain above gives way. Siren towers blare across the Atacama night as workers flee. Within minutes, every seismograph in South America registers the collapse. Panic is building. A white-hot heat signature appears beneath the earth. The energy release is catastrophic. The immediate crisis, over 200 workers trapped below. The government is scrambling. The larger crisis, 340,000 tons of copper production, halted. Convoy after convoy speeds toward the site. The invisible crisis, what happens when the markets open in 6 hours? Nobody sees that third crisis coming. Rescue operations will take months. Debris clearance will take years. The scale of the failure is visible from above. By 4 a.m. London time, copper futures are up 18%. The market is reacting in real time. By 6 a.m., they are up 34%. Panic is setting in across European markets. By the time New York opens, the panic has already set in. Not panic about the workers, panic about the supply. Not panic about the workers, panic about the supply. All eyes are on the same image. Chuquicamata produces 8% of the world's refined copper, a vital 8% for the electric future. Not all of it, just 8%, but enough to bring global production to a grinding halt. But the world had no buffer, no reserve, no backup, just silence where there should be motion. Just-in-time delivery meets a just-now catastrophe. Indicators are turning red across the globe. Power transformers, submarine cables, defense systems, renewable energy infrastructure, they all need it now. They all need copper, every kilowatt of it. The grid is under immense pressure. They all need it now. Production lines are beginning to stall in Japan, and now there is not enough. The backlog just grew by 2 years. Infrastructure is failing. The green energy transition runs on copper. Undersea landing stations are now vulnerable. Every solar panel, every wind turbine, every charging station, the green energy transition runs on copper. The very technology built to save the planet now stalled. The transition just became a trap. Because one mountain in Chile refused to hold, the transition just became a trap for modern energy. Rescue operations will take months. The scale of the disruption is unprecedented. It reaches the entire world. Debris clearance will take years. The economic shockwaves are already hitting the capital at high speed. Production restoration, if it happens at all, will take a decade. Analysis shows the collapse is absolute. The question the world is only beginning to ask: what do we do until then? The Atacama is now the center of global attention. Speculators move faster than rescue workers. Panic ripples through the global market floor. Before the first survivor is found, trillions in paper value have shifted. Catastrophe has become an asset class. The victims bleed, the markets feast, trading floors are in a state of absolute shock. Wall Street awakens to a new reality. The world is changing before the first opening bell. The world scrambles for alternatives. Secondary sources and recycled metal are not enough to bridge the gap. The world scrambles for alternatives. The Democratic Republic of Congo is now in high demand. The process is deliberate and irreplaceable. Every milligram of copper counts in this new world. None of them are enough. None of them are close to enough to replace what was lost. China consumes 54% of the world's copper. Its factories are the foundation of global electronics. Beijing's problem becomes everyone's problem. The foundation of global electronics is starting to crack. The foundations are cracking. Beijing's problem is now the world's problem. Production is stalling. Beijing's problem becomes everyone's problem. Logistics are in absolute chaos. Electrical grids don't fail overnight, but they age, they crack, they break. Solar projects stop. But they age, they crack, they break. Manufacturing is slowing to a crawl in every sector. And when a component fails, the replacement requires copper. Copper that is now strictly rationed. Copper that is now rationed, prioritized, fought over. A world dependent on what it cannot guarantee. Hospitals, defense systems, water treatment. Every critical infrastructure system has copper at its core. Every critical infrastructure system has copper at its core. Not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Not as a luxury, as a necessity. And necessity is about to become scarcity for water. And necessity is about to become scarcity. The world doesn't know its supply is threatened. The large power transformers that run national grids, they are wound with copper, thousands of kilometer. They take 18 months to build. Some take 3 years. The backlog just grew by 2 years. They are wound with copper, thousands of kilometers of it. The backlog is growing daily. The green energy revolution promised to end dependence on fossil fuels. It didn't mention copper. For militaries, it is classified as a strategic resource. Emergency protocols are triggered. The world's armies are already competing for what remains. Strategic resources are locked down. For governments, a security crisis. For the world, the beginning of something no one predicted. When the price of copper triples, desperation rises with it. Infrastructure must now be protected. Police departments are overwhelmed. A crime wave runs parallel to the supply crisis. Utilities are losing millions as neighborhoods go dark. The hunt for copper is relentless. A crime wave runs parallel to the supply crisis and feeds it. The news ticker doesn't stop. In the Congo, the collapse of a Chilean mine is a windfall. Prices have tripled. The world's copper emergency is about to become a humanitarian crisis. The river is a lifeline. When copper becomes scarce, digital infrastructure begins to fray at the edges, pushed to the limit. The topic: copper allocation during a global supply crisis. The world's leaders are meeting. Slowly at first, then suddenly, the internet's physical core is beginning to fail. The Defense Priorities Act has been invoked. Military needs will be met first. Military copper needs will be met first. Everything else waits as the shipyard slows. The process is deliberate and irreplaceable. Every milligram of copper counts. Skilled labor. The large power transformers that run national grids, they are wound with copper. Thousands of kilometers of it. 18 months lead time. The green energy revolution promised to end dependence on fossil fuels. It never promised to end dependence on copper. Wind turbines use 4 times more copper per megawatt than natural gas plants. The transition just became a trap. Projects are stalled at the docks as materials become unavailable. And the collapse of Chuquicamata just triggered emergency protocols in 14 countries. The maps are being redrawn. Every chip needs copper interconnects. Every chip needs copper packaging. Precision is now a luxury. A city that has no idea how close the edge really is. The lights are burning for now. The internet is physical. It is copper. It is fiber with copper terminations. Massive infrastructure is at risk. It is copper. It is fiber with copper terminations. It is powered by copper wound transformers. Staggering complexity. The outcome: a draft protocol that would rank nations by need. The reaction: immediate and fierce. The reaction: immediate, fierce, and politically explosive. Critical mineral security is now the top priority. Missile guidance systems, aircraft carrier power networks, submarine sonar arrays. Military needs come first. The Defense Priorities Act has been invoked. Military copper needs will be met first. Everything else waits. A simple act of trust, a system they cannot see. And copper right now is in a state of absolute crisis. That trust is built on infrastructure. Infrastructure built on copper, a city that has no idea how close the edge really is. For the first time since 1973, the United Nations convenes an emergency session on a single material. Geneva is active. The process is deliberate and irreplaceable. Every milligram of copper counts in this new world. Skilled hands. For governments, copper is classified as a critical mineral. Situation rooms are active. The Defense Priorities Act has been invoked. Military copper needs will be met first. Everything else waits. Pentagon is on high alert. The topic: copper allocation during a global supply crisis. The outcome: a draft protocol. Committee is meeting. When the price of copper triples, desperation rises with it. Infrastructure that was never designed to be guarded must now be protected. Police are logging evidence. Rescue operations will take months. Debris clearance will take years. The scale of the disruption is growing with altitude. Unprecedented failure. European governments have classified the copper crisis as a Tier 1 infrastructure threat. The grid is under pressure. European Control Center. The grid still holding, but only just. Snow falling on a European winter street. Dependence on infrastructure is clear. The briefings are not broadcast, but behind closed doors, the word being used is unprecedented. European Commission crisis meeting. The rescue teams are still digging. The world is still connected, for now. Part 2 begins where the cracks spread further. Mine at dawn. Electrical grids don't fail overnight, but they age. They crack, they break. A new fragility in the pattern. European city night. Copper wealth in unstable regions has always attracted armed conflict. Armed militia checkpoint, tense exchange, Congo belt. The human cost of demand. Artisanal mining operation. Workers with pickaxes. The scramble for alternatives is on. The world's copper emergency is about to become a humanitarian crisis. Military convoy moving through the Congolese jungle, red dirt road. Part 2 begins where the cracks spread further. The rescue continues as dawn breaks over the Atacama. Still connected for now. Within minutes, every seismograph in South America registers the collapse. Panic is building. A white-hot heat signature appears beneath the earth. The energy release is catastrophic. The green energy transition runs on copper. Undersea landing stations are now vulnerable. The very technology built to save the planet, now stalled. The transition just became a trap. Electrical grids don't fail overnight, but they age, they crack, they break. Manufacturing is slowing. And when a component fails, the replacement requires copper that is now rationed. It never promised to end dependence on copper. High voltage infrastructure is at risk. Wind turbines use 4 times more copper per megawatt than natural gas plants. The transition just became a trap. Projects are stalled at the docks. For governments, copper is classified as a critical mineral. Situation rooms are active. And the collapse of Chuquicamata just triggered emergency protocols in 14 countries. For the families, the crisis is personal, intimate, devastating. Santiago is in turmoil. For the corporations, it is a liability event. Media scrutiny is intense. For the world, the beginning of something no scenario plan predicted. Families wait for news. Copper prices have doubled in 11 days. Ships are rerouting across the Atlantic. Thieves are stripping copper from derelict buildings, live power lines, phone networks. Every gram counts. The criminal ecosystem moves faster than policy. Logistics systems are under strain. The material that holds civilization together is now being torn from its foundations. Precious metal. Semiconductors, the brains of the modern world. Taiwan's fabs are under threat. Every chip needs copper interconnects. Every chip needs copper packaging. Supply lines are thin. Taiwan's fabs consume more copper per square meter than almost any other industry. The backbone is weak. Every material scientist in the world is working on copper alternatives, high-temperature superconductors. The pressure of crisis has become the engine of innovation. New York City's subway system runs on copper signaling infrastructure installed in the 1960s. It was already overdue for replacement. The copper it needs is now on a 2-year waiting list. Delays that were months become years. Years become a crisis. An electric vehicle charging network is only as good as its copper supply chain. New stations require copper wire, copper bus bars, copper connections. Old stations require copper for repairs. The EV transition is stalling at the infrastructure layer. Grid failures that would normally take days to repair now take weeks. Replacement transformers are on backorder. Copper cable supply is rationed. Utilities are triaging. Which neighborhoods get power first? A question that was always political now becomes life or death. Hospitals require guaranteed and absolutely uninterrupted power to ensure patient safety and sustain life. But guarantees depend on infrastructure. And infrastructure right now is rationed. The margin between medical system stability and disaster is measured in copper stock levels. Consumer electronics launches are being canceled. Not because of design failures, not because of software problems, because the circuit boards that carry signals inside every chip use copper, and there is not enough copper to build enough chips to fill enough orders. A modern automobile contains 1.5 kilometers of copper wire. An electric vehicle contains 3 times more. When copper supply drops 8%, automotive production drops 20%. Supply chains amplify shortages into crises. Nations are beginning to hoard. Export restrictions on secondary copper are appearing quietly in legislative sessions. What was once freely traded is becoming strategically controlled. Globalization in the copper market is beginning to reverse. China has been quietly stockpiling copper for 2 years. The Chuquicamata collapse wasn't anticipated, but the risk of supply disruption was. Beijing's strategic reserve has 90 days of buffer. The United States, by contrast, has a mere 12 days of buffer remaining. The United States eliminated its copper strategic reserve in 1993. It was called an unnecessary Cold War relic. It was called inefficient. It was called market distorting. Tonight, every senator who voted to end it is getting a briefing they will not forget. The United States eliminated its copper strategic reserve in 1993. Wait, tonight every senator who voted to end it is getting a briefing they will not forget. Peru has become the world's most critical copper source overnight. Its mines, Cerro Verde, Las Bambas, and Tamina, are being pushed harder than ever. The roads to those mines pass through communities already in conflict, and those communities now have leverage they have never had before. Peru's communities have been fighting mining companies for decades. Water rights, land rights, environmental rights. The world is now desperately dependent on Peruvian copper, and the communities blocking access to it know exactly what they're worth. For the first time in history, Peruvian mining communities are negotiating from strength. The global copper crisis has shifted the power balance. Community royalties that were denied for decades are being granted in days. The collapse of one mine has given a voice to thousands of others. Zambia has copper, plenty of it, but producing it requires power, reliable, consistent power. Zambia's power grid runs on hydro, a grid already under stress from drought. The world's copper crisis is about to collide with a water crisis. Zambia's copper production has been cut by 30% due to power shortages. The irony writes itself. The world needs copper to build clean energy. But without clean energy to power the mines, the copper cannot be extracted. The crisis feeds on itself. The cost of shipping copper has increased 280% in 60 days. Insurance premiums for mines in politically unstable regions have tripled. Every link in the copper supply chain is adding cost. The price at the end of the chain reflects all of it, and then some. Economists call it commodity price transmission. When the price of a fundamental input rises, it ripples through every sector it touches. Copper touches everything. The inflation you feel at the grocery store has a mine collapse at its origin. Manufacturing margin compression is now visible in every quarterly report. Companies that never mentioned copper as a risk are writing copper paragraphs. The supply chain crisis has arrived in the income statement, and the income statement is about to arrive in the headlines. The stock market has finally discovered copper. Technology companies, EV manufacturers, grid operators, defense contractors, every sector with copper in its cost structure is repricing. Trillions of dollars in market value are moving, chasing the ghost of a single pillar. Capital is beginning to move at speed, not just away from copper-dependent companies, toward the companies that could solve the problem. A crisis, as always, is someone's opportunity. Aluminum conducts electricity, not as well as copper, but it conducts. It weighs less, it costs less, it is vastly more abundant. For decades, engineers avoided it because copper was available and reliable. Now they are looking at aluminum the way drought-stricken farmers look at a dry well. Substitution is the oldest human response to scarcity. Stone to bronze, bronze to iron, iron to steel. Now, copper to what? The race for the answer defines the next decade of human technology. The internet is not wireless, it is not magical, it is not the cloud. It is millions of kilometers of copper and fiber laid on the ocean floor. It is powered by copper wound transformers at landing stations. And it is beginning to show the strain. The internet is not wireless. It is millions of kilometers of copper and fiber. It is beginning to show the strain. The first internet degradation events have been detected. Not failures, not outages, just latency, slowness, hesitation. But in the architecture of the internet, hesitation is the first sign of stress fracture. And the world has never depended more on a network that has never been more fragile. Slowness, hesitation. In the architecture of the internet, hesitation is the first sign of stress fracture. Grid managers have a term, cascading failure. One failure creates load on adjacent systems. Adjacent systems fail. A dozen countries showing elevated latency, a cluster of amber alerts over sub-Saharan Africa. The chain reaction that ends in blackout begins with a single weakness, and copper scarcity has created many weaknesses at once. The first major copper shortage-linked blackout hits a city of 3 million. It lasts 11 hours. Residents standing on stoops, the city's nervous system flickering. One failure creates load on adjacent systems fail. Governments have known about copper vulnerability for years. Reports were written, warnings were issued, budgets were not allocated. The first major copper shortage-linked blackout hits a city of 3 million. It lasts 11 hours. But that insight arrives after the catastrophe, not before. Battery-powered emergency lights, nurses moving carefully, backup generators running, no one is killed, the generators hold. The fragility of the modern city suddenly visible. Governments have known about copper vulnerability for years. Reports were written, warnings were issued, budgets were not allocated. Personnel at screens showing national grid status, communication systems, resource deployment. Preparation costs less than catastrophe. Confidential directive distributed to all emergency management agencies. Preparation costs less than catastrophe. Fast aerial shot above a city protest. Thousands of people visible, signs raised, the scale of public anger visible from above. A framework, in other words, for a meeting at a later date. A candidate at a podium, a crowd behind them, the words "Energy Security Now" on banners. Political anger becomes a force. Posts about power cuts, rising prices, infrastructure failures, hashtags spreading the anger further. Inflation, unreliable power. The parties that win are the ones with the simplest narratives. They failed us. We will fix it. A movement sensing its moment. Energy security now. Our power, our grid, our nation. Political crises are harder to solve. The weight of an unsolvable problem. Complexity is the enemy of leadership. Heads of state arriving in motorcades. The copper crisis is the unnamed topic in every conversation. At the emergency G20 summit, leaders agree on a framework with no enforcement mechanism. Side conversations between officials, the informal negotiations that determine outcomes. Careful diplomatic language. At the emergency G20 summit, leaders agree on a framework with no enforcement mechanism, no binding commitments, no timeline. Vast, untouched deposits beneath the ice and permafrost. 2 years ago, extracting them would have been considered environmentally unconscionable. Today, 6 nations are issuing Arctic mining permits. Executives reviewing maps of Arctic copper deposits, risk assessors and geologists around the table. Crisis overrides principle. Tents in frozen landscape, equipment running, samples being extracted from permafrost. Copper, staining visible in the rock layers. Part 3 begins where the cracks become fissures. The deep seafloor contains more copper than all land-based mines combined. Unique ecosystems. Life for technology, suddenly visible, and humanity, true to form, is choosing technology. Deep-sea mineral deposits. Life for technology, suddenly visible, and humanity, true to form, is choosing technology. The trade-off is final. The world is changing. Choose technology, choose the future, regardless of cost. Environmentalists have warned for decades. Now the demand is existential. Without copper, civilization loses its lights. No middle ground. Communities standing firm. Millions of years to form, days to extract, the math of survival. What we lose is something equally essential, the cost of light, researching the unknown. Housing construction requires copper, a brake on human development, applied at the worst possible time. The future paused, spools of wire waiting for supply. A skyline in stasis, the physical manifestation of a supply chain collapse. 800 million people without electricity, not an inconvenience, a crisis of development. The concrete shell of a future that has been deferred. Scaffolding in the wind, poles without wire, the promise of light unfulfilled, a connection severed. Determined in a boardroom, the difference between their future and their past. A life by kerosene lamp. Day 90 since the collapse. The world is still running, barely. The Chilean rescue continues. Day 90 since the collapse. The world is still running, barely. The Chilean rescue continues. The fragile confidence that holds civilization together is beginning to fail. All lines lead back. Part 3 begins where the cracks become fissures. The end of the network, the failing grid.
Month 4, the darkness has become the new normal. The first major blackout in Western Europe in 20 years. It begins at 9:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. It is caused ultimately by a transformer that couldn't be replaced on time. A blackout of this scale was last seen in 2003, a software error. This one is different. This one is hardware, copper hardware, and the hardware that failed cannot be replaced for 6 months. The city will manage, but the margin is gone. The second blackout hits while the first is still being managed. 2 cities, 2 separate grid failures, the same root cause, Grid managers call this common mode failure, when multiple systems fail for the same reason simultaneously. Industrial customers are the first to be disconnected when grid capacity is insufficient. Their contracts allow it, the law allows it, but the goods they make in the cars, the steel, the chemicals are suddenly absent. Supply chains that were already thin are now breaking. Food spoilage during power outages adds to shortages already created by supply chain failures. Distribution disruptions compound production shortfalls. The word shortage begins appearing in everyday conversation. Not famine, not disaster, but the gnawing feeling that something isn't right. Militaries around the world are recalculating their copper budgets. Defense systems that were scheduled for maintenance, deferred. New weapons programs that require copper wiring, paused. The world's armies are discovering that their readiness depends on the same supply chain as a consumer electronics company. Russia holds significant copper reserves. It is willing to sell on terms that reflect its current political leverage. The copper crisis has handed authoritarian states a tool that sanctions were meant to remove. Dependency, traded for supply. For the first time since the formation of NATO, the alliance is coordinating copper procurement. Defense industries of member nations are being assigned copper quotas. The word being used in classified briefings is rationing. NATO is rationing a metal. Cellular network degradation has begun in regions with severe infrastructure stress. Not system-wide failure, not complete outages. Just the beginning of a world where connectivity becomes unreliable. A world that cannot function without reliable communication beginning to notice the fraying. When financial systems slow, capital freezes. Capital frozen means payrolls delayed, credit unavailable, investment halted. The copper crisis that started in a mine is now reaching the global financial plumbing. The world runs on electrons. Electrons run on copper. Copper scarcity doesn't affect everyone equally. When triage decisions are made about which infrastructure to prioritize, they follow existing lines. Financial districts, government zones, high-value real estate. The communities that were already underserved become the buffer that protects the privileged. Infrastructure has never been politically neutral. The copper crisis has stripped away the language that made that invisible. People are seeing for the first time who the system was built to protect. That clarity has a momentum of its own. In conflict zones, copper infrastructure has become a deliberate military target. Strip the copper, destroy the grid, destabilize the government. It's a playbook that existed before the crisis. The crisis has simply made it more effective. Nation-state cyber actors have mapped every copper vulnerability in rival power grids. The physical crisis has created digital attack surfaces. An adversary doesn't need to attack the copper. They only need to attack the control systems that manage it during its weakest moment. Every major port on Earth is now experiencing copper-related congestion. Priority shipments creating queues, queues creating delays, delays creating more shortfalls. The supply chain isn't just disrupted, it is experiencing feedback loops. Each delay creates the conditions for the next delay. Interior of a hospital supply chain management office. A director looking at a procurement alert for medical equipment with copper wound motors. The global copper crisis has entered the operating theater, not as a headline, as a maintenance log, as a deferred replacement that becomes a risk, that becomes a failure. Modern agriculture runs on electric motors. Those motors run on copper windings. Irrigation pumps, grain dryers, cold storage, processing equipment. The copper crisis that started in a mine is showing up in crop reports. And crop failures have a word everyone knows: famine. Water treatment plants run on electric motors. Electric motors run on copper. When pumps fail and spare parts are unavailable, redundancy disappears. And water systems without redundancy are one equipment failure from a public health crisis. Governments call it demand management. Energy companies call it load optimization. Ordinary people call it paying more for less. The copper crisis, filtered through the grid, lands in the household budget. The copper crisis, filtered through the grid, lands in the household budget. Where abstract supply chains become very concrete hardship, the crisis is generating innovation at a pace that normal markets never could. Aluminum graphene composites, superconducting polymer hybrids, printed circuit alternatives. None of them ready today, some of them ready in 3 years. But 3 years feels like forever when the grid is faltering now. The world contains more copper than most people realize. It is in the walls of buildings, the wiring of discarded appliances, the guts of obsolete electronics. Recycling copper takes 15% of the energy of mining it. The circular economy isn't an environmental philosophy anymore. It's an emergency protocol. The copper crisis is accelerating off-grid solutions in the developing world. Microgrids using aluminum conductors. Solar direct systems that bypass the distribution network. A crisis in one part of the world creating solutions in another. Adversity forcing the innovation that prosperity resisted. Pharmaceutical cold chains run on refrigeration compressors. Compressors run on copper wound motors. When those motors fail and cannot be replaced, the drugs they protect can be compromised. The copper crisis has reached the medicine cabinet. The first diplomatic disputes directly linked to copper supply have emerged. Nations that share borders with copper transit routes are leveraging that position. Access fees, tariff disputes, border closures. The language of diplomacy giving way to the language of desperation. Militaries are rewriting their doctrine. Critical infrastructure, power grids, communications, water treatment is now officially classified as a primary theater of conflict. The copper shortage has made physical infrastructure the most important battlefield, and every nation is examining how exposed they are. Wide aerial of a major data center cluster, multiple buildings, the scale of the internet's physical infrastructure visible. The world's largest technology companies are the world's largest electricity consumers. Their power requirements are met by infrastructure built on copper, and now they are doing something unprecedented, competing openly with hospitals for copper supply priority. Legislators who have never spoken the word copper in public life are now voting on allocation legislation. The question before them is as old as civilization. Who gets limited resources? Hospitals or defense, cities or rural grids, industry or households? Every answer creates a constituency of losers. Managed brownouts are the grid operator's acknowledgement that the margin is gone. The system is running at 97% of capacity with no room for error. Any fault, any demand spike, any equipment failure tips it over. The world has run out of room for error. The renewables that were supposed to replace fossil fuels are themselves under maintenance stress. Deferred repairs, unavailable parts, declining output. The energy transition is not just stalled, it's running in reverse. The world is burning more fossil fuels this quarter than last year to compensate. In 2015, nations committed to net zero. In this moment, those same nations are restarting coal plants. Not because they don't believe in climate change, because the alternative is darkness, and no government survives darkness. When copper shortage meets climate change, the result is not manageable. A grid under stress during a heat wave cannot cool the most vulnerable. Elderly residents, low-income households without backup cooling. The infrastructure failure that started in a mine ends in deaths that appear in no mine's balance sheet. The economic models show GDP contraction in 34 countries. The models were built before anyone modeled a copper supply disruption of this duration. They're running their models now. The results are not being shared publicly. The engineers have assessed the damage. Full production restoration, 7 to 10 years. Partial production in critical sectors, 3 to 4 years. The world is being asked to manage on less copper for a decade. 6 months since the collapse. Billions of people living with constrained power, rising costs, degraded services. None of them asked for this, none of them caused it, and all of them are now asking the question that changes history: who is responsible? And all of them are now asking the question that changes history: who is responsible? The world has 6 months of experience with a copper crisis. It has learned that modern civilization has no buffer. No margin, no reserve. Part 4. What happens when the last margin disappears?
180 days after the collapse, the world's leaders have gathered. Not to discuss, not to draft a framework for future discussion, to decide, because the alternative to decision is darkness. The proposal on the table is unprecedented. A global copper allocation protocol, binding commitments from every nation on how scarce copper is distributed. Defense, healthcare, grid maintenance, developing nations. In that order, above all commercial interests. The protocol finally passes after intense negotiations. Not unanimously, not without conflict, but it passes, the story of the decade unfolding in real time. For the first time in history, the world has agreed to share a critical material according to human need rather than market price. The Global Copper Coordination Agency, staffed by 400 specialists from 40 nations, operating with the mandate to ensure that every gram of available copper goes where it is needed most. It is the most ambitious act of international resource governance in history. The effects of coordination are not immediate, they are not dramatic, but they are real. The rate of infrastructure degradation is slowing. The margin is beginning to return. The first copper alternative approved for grid-scale use. An aluminum graphene composite conductor with 94% the conductivity of copper. It won't replace copper overnight, but it means the margin is no longer fixed, it is growing. The engineers have returned to Chuquicamata, not to rebuild what failed, but to build what should have been built originally. Sensor-embedded supports, real-time structural monitoring, AI-driven stability analysis. The mine that caused a global crisis is being rebuilt as the safest mine in the world. The world has built what it should have built before the crisis. A global real-time structural monitoring network for critical mines. 17 failures have been detected and prevented in 8 months. 17 disasters that will never make the news because they didn't happen. 30 days of strategic copper reserve. It isn't much, it isn't close to enough for comfort, but it's 30 days more than the world had when the pillar fell. 30 days is the difference between a managed crisis and catastrophe. The lights are coming back on? Not everywhere, not at once, not without cost. But the trajectory has changed. The trajectory has changed. The system is recovering. Designed for materials efficiency, a discipline born from crisis. A discipline that barely existed before the crisis is now taught in every engineering school. How much of this material do we truly need? Can we use less? Can we use something else? The crisis has rewritten the question, how much do we truly need? The copper that exists is being used twice. The recycling rate for copper is at its highest in history. Every copper atom already in circulation is now treated as a resource as valuable as oil, which, it turns out, is exactly how it should have been treated all along. The communities that were blocking roads are now co-owners of the mines. Not metaphorically, legally, with equity stakes. The price of uninterrupted supply was justice. It always was, and the price of stability is now understood. The global copper crisis forced the world to care about where copper comes from. For the first time, supply chain traceability is not optional. Where was this copper extracted? Under what conditions? By whom? Accountability, it turns out, requires a crisis to become mandatory. Zambia powered its copper mines with solar. The nation that couldn't power its extraction is now selling surplus energy. The copper crisis made the investment in renewable-powered mining impossible to delay. And an impossible-to-delay investment turned a struggling economy into a regional energy exporter. Semiconductor engineers have achieved something that was previously considered a decade away. A 40% reduction in copper usage per chip, with no reduction in performance. The copper crisis compressed a decade of progress into 18 months. Necessity as always being the mother. The world's transportation networks are running, not perfectly, not at the level they were before the crisis, but they are running. And the systems that keep them running are now valued in ways they weren't before. The transportation backbone of the world is stable again. The smart grid upgrade delayed for 15 years has been deployed in 12. Every transformer monitored, every substation equipped with predictive sensors. Crisis proved the business case that decades of advocacy could not. Crisis proved the business case that decades of advocacy could not. The crisis is now being taught in schools and universities. The crisis is now being taught in universities and boardrooms. The lesson being taught is not about copper. It is about maintenance. It is about what happens when we stop maintaining the systems that maintain us. The copper crisis forced the development of low-copper electrification systems. Those systems are now being deployed in communities that the copper economy never served. The rate of infrastructure degradation is slowing. In the ruins of one catastrophe, the foundation of another civilization's beginning. 1 year after the collapse of Chuquicamata, the global copper balance is approaching stability. Not because the mine has recovered, it hasn't, it is because of resilience. But because the world has changed how it uses, manages, and values what it has. The crisis enforced what the market never would. Managed stability is the new norm. 47 miners did not come home from Chuquicamata. They were not footnotes. They were the story. Their names are carved in stone now. Their families changed. A crisis that shook the world began with the simplest and most human of tragedies. People going to work and not returning. We honor them now and always. The world is writing the report it should have written before the crisis. Critical infrastructure inventory, strategic reserves for essential materials, supply chain resilience standards, community rights and resource extraction. The reforms that were too expensive before the crisis cost less than the crisis did. The city that almost went dark is redesigning itself for a new era. Less copper, more intelligence, more resilience, more awareness, a smarter grid. The crisis gave it something prosperity couldn't, the knowledge of its own fragility. And from that knowledge, something stronger is being built, a city that endures. Chile sits at the center of the world's most important supply chain. It always did. Every crack, every millimeter of movement, every change in pressure is tracked. The mine that changed the world is now the most watched structure on Earth. A monument to what happens when we stop paying attention. The global economy is recovering. The global economy is recovering to something different, transparent and managed. Materials once taken for granted are now managed with reverence. The era of resource invisibility is over. The safety standard that didn't exist is now mandatory in 47 countries. Every mine-producing strategic materials is monitored in real time. The cost of non-compliance is now known. It is measured in civilizations. The cost of non-compliance is now known. It is measured in civilizations. Chile sits at the center of the world's most important supply chain. It always did. The difference now is that Chile knows it, the world knows it, and the terms have changed. Resource extraction in exchange for development, not poverty. A country that was at the center emerges with a new compact. 3 months without a grid failure, hard-won stability. This is not a small thing. This is what it cost. One mine collapse, 2 years of crisis. A world that finally takes infrastructure seriously. This is what it bought. A world that finally takes infrastructure seriously. The world created an institution it should have created after the 2003 Northeast blackout, after the 2011 Fukushima power crisis, after every warning it received and ignored. It took a faulty pillar in a Chilean mine to build the foundation the world needed. A new age of resilience has begun. The mine is producing again, not at full capacity. That will take years. But the first copper from the restored Chuquicamata is flowing. And every ton is more valued, more tracked, more respected than any copper ever was before. The red metal returns to the world. The next city is being built differently. Less of everything that can be reduced, more of everything that lasts. Infrastructure designed for resilience, not just for function. The materials of civilization, used with the care they deserve. A generation is growing up that knows where their power comes from. They are building the world the crisis revealed was necessary. They are not inheriting the world they were promised. They are building the world the crisis revealed was necessary. The world is still lit, not by luck, not by abundance, by people who decided in the middle of a crisis that the systems we depend on are worth defending. By engineers who built alternatives, leaders who chose cooperation, communities who demanded justice, workers who went underground knowing the risk and kept the copper flowing. One mine, one collapse, one crisis. How fragile are we? How fragile are we? The answer, more fragile than we knew, but also more capable than we feared. The lights are on, for now. Remember why we fought for the light. Remember why we endure.